As a long-standing fan of the superhero genre, it's difficult to ignore the repetition within it. After a while, you begin to question how many times you can watch Batman subdue the Joker, or see Superman save our planet, or watch the Avengers come back to perform another tenure as humanity's only hope against some unquantifiable evil. At what point is the line drawn, and what can we expect to wait beyond it? How can these stories adapt and grow with their audiences? And why is it that we need this change? Superhero fatigue isn't something new. Sure, the Marvel Universe and their oversaturation within both theaters and streaming platforms has pushed fans to seek for more nuanced content in other places, but this isn't the first time the superhero narrative was subverted in favor of a more reflective interpretation of our fictional saviors. In fact, series like Invincible and The Boys follow a long history of caped crusaders who defied the original archetypes set up and perpetuated after Superman's debut in Action Comics. So why now are these narratives so intriguing? To understand the appeal of realism within superhero narratives today, we have to look at a comic so influential to this development that its content feels almost biblical when applied to the interpretation of its modern counterparts. And though this may seem dramatic, I'm confident in saying that without Watchmen, the world of intrigue that Invincible has become for me and many other fans would cease to exist entirely. Watchmen is a beautiful, thought-provoking comic that explores the alternate history of a United States crippled by political unrest. It takes the complexities of our country and puts them into characters meant to represent multiple facets of philosophical thinking. Through the comic, we can question our higher powers, our own Watchmen, and try to understand why these heroes would continue to risk their lives for the seemingly pointless battle for peace. It's this same concept that makes Invincible, specifically the television adaptation, so widely acclaimed. And in a strange way, it's the concept that sets the two apart. To understand the appeal and differences between both approaches, we have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. They're both exploring reality, but through what means? In this analysis, my intention is to understand how morality, nostalgia, and trauma act as guiding themes to shape realistic superhero narratives. In doing this, I hope to illustrate that humanity and the deep understanding of that construct is what distinguishes both Watchmen and Invincible from their cliché counterparts. And with that distinction being made, I'll try to come to a consensus as to why we long for these narratives to begin with. So without further ado, let's see what we can find out about the postmodern hero. Before I can really get into my interpretation, I want to give a basic understanding of postmodernism as it applies to this discussion. Though it can be up for interpretation whether or not these narratives can be considered postmodern, I personally believe that their emphasis on parody, satire, and self-awareness
Well, it's my old friends, token diversity and gender stereotypes.
make both Watchmen and Invincible perfect contenders for the narrative mode. Postmodernism is a focus on the ambiguity of perception, a concept employed in each story to emphasize the subversion of superhero tropes well known by their target audience. As previously stated, the use of postmodernism is integral to the way we consume these superhero narratives. With the context of all the repetition that comes before both Watchmen and Invincible, viewers are able to recognize characters and their arcs, while also being aware of how these arcs diverge from what we're used to. Through postmodernism, we can put aside our suspension of disbelief in favor of an intellectual awareness that doesn't take away from the experience, but instead adds to it immensely. It's the use of this narrative mode that sets the foundations for this discussion, so keep it in mind as we go through the three key themes that I believe make Watchmen and Invincible so groundbreaking.
Why did you make me do this?
Morality. Morality is the foundation of a superhero. It's what makes them who they are as a fighter for justice and what determines their actions toward that justice. In Watchmen, this theme can be shown through a myriad of characters, especially when considering the philosophical dialogue present throughout the comic. But to narrow it down, I chose to focus on two heroes who I believe will compare well with Omni-Man from Invincible, the comedian and Ozymandias. This is because both men and their differing morals offer the first link in understanding how the portrayal of humanity amplifies a realistic superhero narrative. They are war and peace personified, used to illustrate the shocking similarities between the two concepts and how the power to manipulate them should never be as accessible as they are to these heroes. Let's first look at the comedian, a deliberately amoral character that represents the inherent violence within humanity. Not necessarily evil, but instead brutal. He's brutally honest, brutally aware of the very system that perpetuates the violence that he participates in and is employed to extinguish. This is where he gets his name. He understands the practical joke that peace has become, and knows that the only way to hide this fact is through war and violence. But when forced with Veidt's truth, the plan to murder millions for the sole purpose of achieving that very peace, the comedian breaks. He can't fathom the idea, can't accept what he's put into practice for years being displayed so bluntly before him. When the comedian realizes what Ozymandias is going to do, it forces a moment of self-reflection so suffocating that he can't help but to tell someone else, to confess. He's forced to recognize the weight of the violence he's excused and measure it against the grand scale of Ozymandias' design. In this moment, the comedian realizes there is no salvation, that the joke was on him for believing he'd figured out the meaningless system. Because of Ozymandias, the comedian knows the truth, and for that, he must die. So in what way does that translate to Ozymandias representing peace? Simple. It kinda doesn't. When I reference peace within the Watchmen comics, I'm not talking about the word as we know it. I'm talking about a demented version of a concept so truly unobtainable in this fictional setting that the only way to merely replicate its effects is by committing an act of terrorism so catastrophic that the rest of the world aligns out of fear. I'm talking about a man so delusional in his superiority that he believes this decision is his to make. Ozymandias represents peace by highlighting its inability to exist. He may be able to scare the world into submission for a time, but nothing will change the lie that his empire was built on. And once the curtain is pulled back, there's no telling what kind of world will remain. This is what broke the comedian, the realization that he and Ozymandias are only different in theory. What separates these two men and our perceptions of their morality is time. Throughout his years of service, the comedian has murdered countless people. We see him committing acts of senseless violence with a smile on his face. He's uncompromising in his beliefs, and yet we find ourselves understanding him better than Ozymandias, the man who believes himself to be the savior of humanity. This is because Adrian Veidt, in his savior's complex, has driven himself outside of the human race and into a fascist state of mind that allows him to excuse murdering millions. Realizing the scope of Veidt's plan and its presumably instantaneous effects, the comedian is forced to reconcile with his own heinous acts, thus allowing the reader to put into perspective the role both men played in the destruction of the human race. This is why Omni-Man is such a great comparative character. He's like Ozymandias in the sense that he's unafraid to enact terrible violence to steer the world toward his idea of salvation, but also like the comedian as he becomes more and more aware of the brutality that makes his goal unreachable. And only when faced with the mangled, blood-soaked body of his son does he realize what role he plays in his own hopelessness. Because of his prolonged lifespan as a Viltrumite, Nolan is originally unable to understand the significance of human life. He views the conquering of Earth as merely an end, with the means being justified because of how short-lived humans are in comparison to him. Within his time on Earth and the events of the first season, we watch this idea erode as it finally comes time for Omni-Man to do what he's been sent for, and he's unable. This is because Nolan is a character at odds with himself, questioning the reflexes instilled in him by Viltrum, while simultaneously damning the humanity that raises these questions to begin with. He's the point where war and peace meet, the discussion being held within almost every realistic superhero narrative. How does the corrupting influence of perceived or legitimate power affect our heroes and the choices they make? Nolan's arc is about deconstructing this power, watching as the high ground he held slowly slips away, leaving only his humanity behind. His regret. For all three men, morality and time are interlinked, guiding them through destructive lives only to one day face the truth of their hypocrisy.
Don't lie to me! I know you killed them, Nolan.
Nostalgia. Nostalgia is one of the main reasons for the realistic superhero revival and a prominent theme in both Watchmen and Invincible. Though this theme is shown to us in different ways between both forms of media, I think that by looking at how the original Silk Spectre and Debbie Grayson utilized the concept of nostalgia within their own lives, we'll be able to understand nostalgia's greater impact on realistic superhero narratives as a whole. For Sally Jupiter, the original Silk Spectre, her nostalgia for the sexual appeal she had in her past led her into the arms of a man who attempted to rape her, the comedian, and lying to their daughter about it her whole life. Through searching for some solace in memory, she's constantly forced to enact a sort of cognitive dissonance that blurs her perspective and drives her further from her daughter as her story goes on. Though in the end she's portrayed as being content with her lot in life, we have to wonder how much of that comes from her false naivety, the way she forces herself to see the past as better times, when in reality, that lie is exactly what makes the past so painful. In Invincible, we get a similar concept of nostalgia through Debbie Grayson, who is forced to confront the reality that her life with Nolan was a lie. In direct contrast to Silk Spectre, we see Debbie actively going through the emotions that come with this confrontation and trying to figure out how to cope with the truth that she was given. She does think of the past as better times, but because of her ignorance then, rather than Silk Spectre's forced ignorance now. The difference between Sally and Debbie are their coping mechanisms, and what role nostalgia plays in both of their experiences. Sally has a child with a man who beat and attempted to rape her because of her overwhelming nostalgia for a past that made her in some ways feel in control of the way she was perceived as a woman. This oxymoron is a prime example of how the blinding effects of nostalgia allow the heroes within Watchmen to fight for a world where peace seems impossible almost directly due to their existence. Debbie's character uses this idea of betrayal and abuse and takes us through the complex character arc of a woman trying to understand and cope with what has happened to her, grieving the idea of the husband she once knew, the man she loved. It's through this emotional journey that we can understand how nostalgia guides the creators of Invincible, how they take into consideration the familiarity of their audience and deconstruct all that we thought we knew. Both versions of the superhero narrative are playing with our connections to similar material, but in different ways that match the audience's modern context. For Watchmen and Invincible, nostalgia is what motivates the creators to come up with these superhero-based concepts, and it's a theme within each depiction that deeply affects the characters and how they view their world. It works doubly throughout these realistic superhero narratives to add an unmistakable bit of humanity and allow audiences to relate to these otherwise inconceivable scenarios.
Oh, shit.
Trauma. The last theme that I want to talk about is trauma, as it's one that I believe connects to each of the themes previously mentioned and adds to the overall exploration of humanity that makes these narratives so compelling. Trauma is what births the superhero. It's those moments that change the trajectory of a life, and it's how a creator gets us to care. This idea is referenced in excerpts from Hollis Mason's book, Under the Hood, where in the first chapter he retells advice that he was given to start with the saddest thing he could think of. Only within making this video have I realized how reflective that is of the superhero comic formula overall. Some traumatic event has occurred in the lives of almost every one of these characters, and that's no different for those in Watchmen and Invincible. But for today, I'm only going to focus on Mark Grayson, as I believe he has no direct counterpart in The Watchmen. By the time we arrive in the Watchmen storyline, most of the action has already happened. The Keene Act was passed, and the only heroes left are portrayed more as government pawns rather than enforcers of justice. In this world, the integrity that came with being a hero has died. The golden era has long since gone, and the world these heroes live in has been revealed before we ever came to know it. A bleak place devoid of any possibility for peace, no matter how hard they try. In Invincible, Mark's story is still being written, and we watch as the trauma he endures shapes his view of the world and his place within it, thus allowing the audience to follow along as the narrative decides what it wants to say about the society it's reflecting. By throwing Mark into these scenarios, constantly forcing him to question his own moral code while simultaneously coping with the brutality that surrounds him, we see how trauma works not only to structure his character, but also to frame the use of postmodernism within these realistic superhero narratives. Trauma and postmodernism have had this sort of cause and effect relationship long before the subversion of superheroes became such a popular form of entertainment. In his article, Cultural Trauma and the Postmodern Voice, Ted Morrissey claims that there are 3 key points to the intersection of trauma and postmodernism: intertextuality, repetition, and a dispersed or fragmented narrative voice. But for the sake of our discussion, I want to focus specifically on repetition. Throughout Invincible's 3 seasons, we can see repetition being used to help navigate the moral shifts in Mark's character as he experiences trauma. The first and most obvious use of this technique is the series title card. Once per episode, usually towards the beginning, a character is cut off before saying the word to reveal said title card, which undergoes a slight change each time it's shown. This does happen in all 3 seasons, but my favorite progression has to be Season 1's use of blood to show the continued realization of Mark's reality being a superhero. As the season goes on, we watch Mark continuously confronted by the truth of the life he's wanted since his father told him he would get powers. From getting hit a bit too hard by his dad during training, to watching people die and feeling partially responsible for the death of thousands more, Mark is forced to experience countless amounts of trauma that he would have otherwise never been exposed to had he not become a hero. Because of this, we see the name of his super identity, Invincible, being constantly defaced by the blood that's drawn, almost specifically because of his arrival on the crime-fighting scene. Mark is not only experiencing trauma, but he's viewing himself as the cause of this trauma, not being good enough to save everyone who needs it. This feeling is only amplified once he realizes the truth about his father and tries to stop him from taking over Earth. In this instance, Mark is beaten nearly to death by the man he idolized his entire life and is forced to finally accept that his world will never be the same. From here, we can see another use of repetition within the series, helping to outline the effects of Mark's trauma through visual parallels between his father. After the Season 1 finale, we get many scenes of Mark actively working to dispel the idea that he is at all like his father, something he used to want more than anything. In the first episode of Season 2, we see him arguing with Cecil about this distinction.
You know who else said that to me?
I'm not my dad. I'm not my dad!
Here is where the concept of the continued visual parallels between Mark and Nolan take root. As the series progresses and we watch Mark try to prove that he is actually good compared to the legacy that Omni-Man left behind, there are many scenes that cue the viewer in on the significance of this struggle for his character. 2 scenes that I often see together in fan edits come in the final episode of both Season 1 and 2. Here we get the repetition of framing between Mark and Nolan as they pummel their opponents nearly to death. For Mark, this is the first instance where he seems to really lose control of himself and actually kill someone. And I think it's significant that we see this pivotal moment for his character in a way that is reminiscent of the traumatic event that occurred at the end of the first season. Not only does this help solidify how affected Mark is by his own actions, but it also helps show his inability to truly denounce the parts of him that come directly from his father. Though we later find out that Angstrom Levy, the man Mark thought he killed, was able to survive the assault, we see how the idea of having murdered another person plagues our protagonist. He continues to try and prove his difference from his father in Season 3 by working alongside Cecil and the Global Defense Agency, but when Mark finds out about the employment of villains he's previously obtained, he confronts Cecil, which leads to a fight between him and these beings called the Reanimen at the GDA headquarters, the same place Omni-Man murdered the original Guardians of the Globe. The repetition in this fight scene is clearly intentional, but instead of seeming out of control, Mark now comes across as almost scarily composed, able to quickly and effectively dismantle his opponents the same way his father had when in that very room. Yet, there's still a clear balance within him. If Season 2's parallels between Mark and Omni-Man were meant to represent the struggle for a son to understand how to be different from his father, then the parallels in Season 3 are meant to emphasize the inability for that distinction to ever truly be made. Only by the end of this most recent season does Mark finally recognize the balance between his violent Viltrumite heritage and his compassionate human nature that is necessary for him to be able to protect not only the ones he loves, but the planet as a whole. Through the postmodernist use of repetition to relay trauma, we're able to watch the struggle toward this balance and relate it back to the reality that these realistic superhero narratives are often attempting to reflect. This is what I believe to be the major difference between Watchmen and Invincible, and why I only wanted to focus on Mark for this portion of our discussion. In Watchmen, we're meant to believe the fate of the world as decided, only able to be delayed by the heroes. In Invincible, this future is constantly shifting with the moral compass of our main character, a young man who continues to fight for humanity despite its flaws and his own. It's about a balance between good and evil embodied by Mark Grayson, a balance that's pointedly rejected in The Watchmen.
What will you have after 500 years?
You, Dad. I still have you.
So as for my research question, how do morality, nostalgia, and trauma act as guiding themes to shape realistic superhero narratives? I think that these themes highlight the humanity that has been missing from a lot of the more classic superhero content. By being unafraid to express the complicated nature of humanity and subverting the superhero tropes we're used to, these narratives are able to adhere to an audience sick of being sold unrealistically happy endings. This same concept is shown to us through the pirate comics in The Watchmen. We want media that reflects the bleakness of reality, similar to the films that sprang from the New Hollywood movement. And by relaying these truths of lived experience, the creators show a certain respect to their audience that sometimes feels lacking in Marvel's clear cash grab cinematic structure. I think that any form of media needs to adapt and grow with its consumers, and that's no different for superheroes. Though Watchmen in large part started the shift toward realism that I believe was necessary for masked vigilantes, it's Invincible that carries out this legacy and continues to assert superheroes within relevant culture.